Welcome all to this session with the winners of the 2019 Malcolm Forbes Award from the Overseas Press Club for Best International Business Reporting. I'm Tim Ferguson, former editor of Forbes Asia, and I was the head judge for the category. It's my pleasure today to introduce and congratulate our two winners from the Wall Street Journal, Sean Mcclain and Nick Kustov. Sean is in Tokyo, where he does his reporting, and Nick is in Paris. Guys, congratulations. And I have to say that dealing with a hopefully helpful intermediary in New York is not unlike your day-to-day jobs with the Wall Street Journal, is it?
Yeah, it sounds familiar, especially the 1 o'clock in Tokyo part of it.
Well, I could see you're surviving with the help of medicinal aids there. Well, this award was for a series of articles in 2019 dealing with the intrigue, both corporate and personal, surrounding the downfall of one of the most celebrated business executives on the planet, Carlos Ghosn. I'm going to start this off by attempting to capsulize the background to this story. Ghosn, who was born in Brazil of French-Lebanese heritage, was by the 1990s a rising executive star in France at Michelin and later at Renault, where he was blessed, I guess, with the nickname Le Cost Killer for his attempts to rationalize the processes at very established, and in the case of Renault, once state-owned French enterprises. In the late 1990s, Ghosn was an integral part of an effort that Renault took to construct a financial and operational alliance with Nissan Motor of Japan. Nissan was larger, but foundering in the wake of the long lost decade of Japan. In the early 2000s, Ghosn seemed to be making great headway with the resuscitation of Nissan. He enjoyed, even in Japan, a rather heroic reputation, rarely for a foreigner or a gaijin to enjoy that sort of adulation in Japan. This continued, as far as most of us were aware, for more or less the next decade or so, so that by 2018, he was overseeing a sort of broad international automotive empire, which by then had incorporated the smaller Mitsubishi Motors as well. He made the international rounds of Davos and all the similar festivities, and was the subject of multiple flattering profiles in the business press. I'm sure I was involved in at least a few of them. Then on November 19th, 2018, Ghosn, returning by international flight to Japan, is subject to a surprise and sudden arrest, and very quickly thereafter is deposed as chairman of Nissan by that company's officials. This was the start of a 13-month confinement period for Ghosn, both in jail and in home custody under Japan's rather strict confinement rules, leading ultimately in December 2019 to his rather miraculous escape as he was spirited out of Japan in a box to seeming exile in Lebanon and his future, which is subject to uncertainty, shall we say. And that's where I want to begin today. We're going to flip the script a bit and just update matters before we get into the nitty-gritty of the great reporting of 2019. Nick, I think you were going to bring us up to date on what has become with Ghosn and his enablers.
Sure, yeah, I can bring us up to date. I mean, so Carlos Ghosn at the moment is in Lebanon. He's out of the reach of Japanese justice. He's a Lebanese citizen. Obviously, Lebanon does not extradite its own citizens. So he's I guess he's living as a free man. The issue for him is that there's an Interpol red notice, so he can't travel internationally. And that's something which we expect at some point he'll try to lift. But for now, that's what Carlos Ghosn's up to. Some of the people who helped him, for example, there's a father-son duo who are in a Massachusetts jail at the moment, who Japan are trying to extradite to Japan, and so that's working its way through the US kind of court and political system as we speak. Sean can maybe bring us up to date on Greg Kelly, who's on trial at the moment in Tokyo. Sean, do you want to speak about Kelly?
Yeah, sure. Greg Kelly, just in case you didn't know, was the man who was arrested alongside Carlos Ghosn on November 19th. He was headed what they call the CEO office, and he was charged alongside Ghosn with attempting to hide roughly $90 million in Carlos Ghosn's deferred compensation. And that trial has been ongoing for the past few months and will probably carry on until September next year. There's also the case of the Turkish pilots and flight attendants who were on the private jet that spirited Ghosn out of Japan and into Turkey and then on to Lebanon. So quite a few legal cases going on in the Carlos Ghosn case, none of which seem to involve Carlos Ghosn.
Suffice to say, the Japanese authorities were furious over that escape.
That's putting it mildly. They outrage, and yeah, they're pretty furious, and they're not going to give up. This is going to go on for a while.
Well, let's go back to November 19th, 2018, and that arrest and very sudden downfall at Nissan. Were you fellows as shocked as so many of us were?
Yeah, I mean, I remember very clearly. It was 5:30-ish p.m. I was supposed to go home and cook an anniversary dinner for my wife. And my colleague, as I was walking out the door, said, "Hey, did you see the news? They're reporting that Carlos Ghosn got arrested." And I think my most coherent response was, "What?" And I went home at 3:30 in the morning that night, and it was pretty much for 2 straight weeks of staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning in the office trying to figure out what the heck had happened.
Nick, was there shock in Paris?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a shock in Paris. It was the morning for us. Yeah, he's a huge name. One thing that I do remember, because you go into reporter mode quite quickly. Obviously, you have to try and get a story out, try and understand what's happening. And it's, usually you can at least reach representatives of both sides or make a decent effort to. And it was really, I mean, obviously we had one side of the story, which was, the Nissan CEO, Saikawa, gave a press conference, and, we could hear what the Japanese side said, but on the Ghosn side, it was impossible to get any information about what he thought of the allegations, about whether he was saying he was innocent, whether he was admitting to what they were saying he did. I mean, it was, in the early days, a very, very one-sided story. And Sean, maybe you remember this better than me, but I remember it being a big story when we finally understood that Ghosn was contesting the charges against him. And I think that was weeks into the reporting.
It was weeks until we heard directly from him. I mean, literally in the days after his arrest, it was a scoop when anybody got anything from the Ghosn side that said he was innocent, or that he thought that there was nothing to these charges. In fact, we didn't really understand what the charges were for like days. Wow, maybe like 48 hours. I think we were the first to get out any sort of notion of what was going on or what this all was about. But yeah, at first we had no idea. Nobody knew what was going on.
So after the scramble for the spot stories at the outset, obviously this is a story that is breaking in front of the whole world business press. So you not only have a very confusing set of circumstances, at least initially, but intense competition. How does the reporting knack kick into gear at that point to try to discern what really is happening and how you can tell it?
I guess I'll go first. I mean, look, like, it was just a lot of shoe leather. I mean, in Japan, look, I was calling through my Rolodex, obviously, and none of the normal sources I use within that company knew what the heck was going on. There was maybe 4 or 5 people within Nissan who had any clue what this was about or how it came about or who was involved. And just finding those people was literally a function of going through corporate registries, finding addresses, and then going to their house late at night and standing outside their home until they came home and asking questions. Like, it was just like a process of like elimination. I remember the night where I finally got the phone call to where somebody would tell me what this is about. It was just after I'd been standing outside the house of like the head of government affairs at Nissan for like 3 hours waiting for some sort of comment. I mean, that was the gist of it. So it's really hustling. This was like 90% of reporting is just working harder than the competition if you're going to beat them, and so it's just brute strength and sort of stubbornness in those early days to sort of just get anything. At that point, like, any information was massive news. They just sort of arrested the biggest name in the auto industry, one of the biggest names in the auto industry, and it was our job to sort of tell people what the heck had happened. And we had like none of the normal sources were any good.
So are you crossing paths with your business media competitors? Can you see them or hear their footsteps while you're trying to do this?
I mean, obviously, look, like the Wall Street Journal, there are a select number of publications that we consider to be direct competitors, but honestly, like, the race was against the local press, and that's being out in the bureaus, that's kind of what it is. I mean, Nick, I'm sure, is constantly chasing Les Echo and others, and I'm chasing Nikkei and Asahi and Yomiuri and Sankei and all these other.
I would say people like FT, Bloomberg, Reuters all did really, really well in this story. So
yeah, of course.
My answer to your question, Tim, would be absolutely. I mean, they were trying to do exactly the same thing that we were doing. They were phoning the same people. They had often the same reflexes. I mean, the issue was as well that even if you got through to someone who was willing to talk to you about Ghosn, or whether they thought he was innocent, guilty, it was often people who knew Ghosn very well, but who had no idea what he was being accused of, or didn't have any information. Like, I mean, his family after a while were in the press saying, we think this is a coup from Nissan. But really they had no proof. I mean, it was very difficult, other than a hunch that this was the case. And so I think that made the story harder as well. But for sure, people we called, there were footsteps from competitors in the international press and the local press. I mean, yeah, it was a huge story, and we basically, that's all we did 24/7, and that's what our competitors did 24/7 as well. So.
Sean, I think in Japan you face an unusual sort of situation in competing with the national press, and that is because most of the corporate reporters have these press clubs and such, where it's a very tight, insular sort of environment. Can you describe that quickly, and how you overcame whatever advantage might attain to that?
So the press clubs are interesting. So they have basically bureaus within all of the ministries, and including the prosecutor's office. And so a lot of the information coming out was from the prosecutor's press club, where you basically have 2 reporters who live inside the prosecutor's office, and at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. at night, after the work is done, we'll go up, to whatever prosecutor and have a cup of coffee with him and chat informally. And the foreign press has zero access to any of that. So still to this day, the prosecutors don't provide information to the foreign press. Everything we got was from other sources. So that was a huge disadvantage in the early days. And it was really where we sort of started to catch up and then pass the press here, was the fact that it wasn't easy for us, I guess is the way to put it. We had to work harder for it. So in the end, our base of sourcing was much broader and much more international. It wasn't just the prosecutors deciding to hand over, several documents or provide a half-hour briefing of the latest thing that they wanted to appear in the front pages of Japanese newspapers. So in the end, we got the information, but it was a huge, huge disadvantage at first. I mean, none of the foreign press knew anything about what this was about for a good 48, 72 hours. So it was really just picking up the phone, talking to people, and eventually, as more people started to learn information, or as the investigation broadened, more people knew things, and so there was more sources that you had that were being briefed and willing to brief you. And honestly, like any good breaking news story that's controversial, like you've got a competition for owning the story, and so you sort of build that momentum. As long as you're in the game publishing stories and people see you're relevant and important and they should talk to you, you sort of snowball slowly until you're the voice that everybody wants to talk to, and you sort of build momentum that way. But it was really just Nick and I, and honestly several others at the Wall Street Journal. This was not just the two of us in the early days, calling all of our sources and working 16-hour days, 6 days a week, 7 days a week to try to stay on top of the story.
So as the smoke behind the events begins to clear a bit and some of the motivations emerge, you guys build toward a March story, a backgrounder, a TikTok, as they're kind of called in the trade, that seeks to really explain what was behind these amazing events. Give me a sense of what's going on in the reporting during those couple of months.
Nick, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, yeah, it's yeah. So I think I know which story you're referring to. So basically, I mean, look, early on there was one narrative. Very quickly, there's like two competing narratives, which is this is purely Carlos Ghosn's wrongdoing, or this is a plot by Nissan because Carlos Ghosn is planning a merger. And so really it's just like, the two narratives are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and it's just trying to find as many documents as you can to see which one of these things is true. And at the beginning we didn't have a whole ton of documents, but I guess as by the time we get to March, we did start to have a lot of emails, bank transfers, like various other documents, which kind of help to stand up one or the other or both of these competing narratives. And so, I guess we felt at that point that we had sufficient evidence to pretty strongly stand up, as I say, one or the other narrative. And that's how we got there. I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah, Nick's 100% right there. It's just the one thing that had always stuck in this story is why it happened when it did, right? Why was Carlos Ghosn arrested when he was arrested? And to hear a lot of people within Nissan talk about it is, well, they just figured it out then, and somebody decided to blow the whistle then, and anything that followed afterwards was all Carlos Ghosn's fault because he was a very naughty man. And on the Renault side and elsewhere, a lot of people suspected that, well, it's because he was planning a merger. Obviously, that was why this happened. And it was too simple. Like, so I mean, Nick did a lot of yeoman's work on this one, trying to nail this down, that the people, the group of 4 individuals who ultimately provided the prosecutors the evidence necessary to arrest him, were spurred on by this notion that Carlos Ghosn was planning to finally merge together Renault and Nissan. That was the sort of spark that triggered, as one person that we talked to here in Japan said it was sort of bubbling over of magma, that sort of the pressure had been building, and this sort of the anger and frustration with where Carlos Ghosn was heading with Nissan finally bubbled over and forced people to, not force people, but encourage people to sort of speak out and point fingers at things that they'd sort of seen that was the impetus for this. So we were able to show that it was really there was a corporate intrigue angle to this whole story.
And until this point, the beat reporters at Nissan simply weren't aware of this tension that was developing at the high ranks.
You're talking about the local press here?
Well, and the international business press.
And you, Sean, basically, were you not aware of this?
Look, I mean, there had been obviously a lot of press reports about, Carlos Ghosn was thinking about a merger despite his public denials that was going to happen. And I think if you ask Carlos Ghosn today, he would still say, I wasn't planning a merger. This is not a merger, even though it's a merger. But the dissatisfaction with Carlos Ghosn, the fact that people were angry about where he was taking the company, I don't think that came through at all. I mean, look, like, you cover any company as a beat reporter, and there's going to be a large percentage of the people you talk to who think the CEO is an idiot and should be replaced, right? Like, it's part of the job. Like, you're going to break some eggs. So I think we all took whatever we were hearing about that with a grain of salt and just thought Carlos Ghosn had been at the helm for 20 years. He'd rescued that company. The company was doing well because of him, and he was ostensibly running two companies and then adding a third and performing well. And so everybody thought that he was Superman, and therefore the companies he was overseeing would follow wherever he wanted to lead them, because they always had. So I think we were all of us were genuinely shocked that this had happened. Nobody suspected any of this.
In hindsight, and I'm in France, I'm a little bit further away from this, but in hindsight, I think you can look back and see that there were clues, right? In some of what Saikawa said, various other small clues that maybe all was not as happy camp as maybe we thought.
Saikawa was by this point the CEO of Nissan and more or less Ghosn's number two there, essentially. Is that right?
That's correct. He was his hand-picked successor as CEO.
Right. So in a sense, personally, there's a bit of treachery involved here as well.
Well, I should qualify, yes, but I should qualify that Saikawa found out about all of this in early October. So just over a month before the arrest happened. So that's the other weird thing about this is, I mean, it's a interesting debate to have over cocktails anytime with anybody, which way is better. So normally in the US, if you figure out that your CEO or the leader of your company or any top executive has done something bad, usually they handle that quietly within the board to protect the company, right? In this case, what made it so unusual is that a group of executives within Nissan found something that they thought was inappropriate, but didn't tell the board and didn't tell the CEO for months, and instead worked with prosecutors secretly. So that was one thing that was really unusual, and I think contributed to the whole surprise angle of this, because you can't, if you sort of bring this to the board, I would have heard about it, right? Mm-hmm. Or if they brought it to Renault's board, Nick would have heard about it, right? So that's part of it, is that they went direct to the prosecutors, and it was just done completely in secret. Like literally four people at Nissan knew what was happening with the prosecutors.
These were executives below the level of the CEO, Saikawa.
Correct. Yeah. So Saikawa was not told until early October.
Right.
I know there's been some debate about that, but yeah, that's our reporting shows that it was early October that he was shown. Okay.
So as you're gathering string for this, what turned out to be a stellar narrative, storytelling narrative of in March of what happened, why it happened, who did what to whom. Nick, you mentioned the document search. That was obviously critical. Also, you're looking for the killer anecdotes and such. Is somebody particularly helpful in providing the behind the scenes detail?
Yeah, I mean, several people, because these anecdotes always have to be checked. So, yeah, several people are starting to provide behind the scene details, and you know, I think also because people were nervous at the beginning about speaking because they're worried that maybe they don't have all the pieces. They maybe don't have an understanding of everything that's gone on. I think when you get to February, March, people are like, okay, well, you know, I understand what's happened now. And so I'm more willing to take a risk and to speak to reporters and to tell them what I think happened and to show them, you know, proof that that's the way it did indeed happen. So yeah, some people are particularly helpful. Obviously, there are also sources that now we've developed for 2-3 months that we've spoken to, that trust us, that can see that we're people who keep our words, that we respect our agreements. And so they open up a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but the anecdotes again, I mean, you have to stand them up. I mean, you have to be comfortable that they're true and that they happen exactly as you reported them. And that was not always easy.
Especially in this case where it was a dinner between two people and we had to try to stand it up. You know, that's not the easiest thing to do.
No.
Yeah, that's true. That took some standing up, that anecdote, actually.
So I'm going to press you two for a moment and dodge as necessary, but I'm sure you're trying to reach the principals in this drama, including Ghosn, repeatedly in order to verify or derive some of these stories. Are you having instead to rely on people below that level, or were you successful at some point in breaking through to the big boys?
It depends on your definition of big boys. I mean, Ghosn obviously when he was in jail was extremely hard to reach. Obviously, I mean I read it somewhere that something that the New York Times reporters did, which I think was actually very clever, was to send. I think they sent like stamped envelopes with letters so that Ghosn could write to them from jail. And I think from what I read, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But from what I read, that those envelopes and that paper was sent back to them by the jail. So, I mean, people were going through great lengths to try and get to Carlos Ghosn. But
we sent him a gift basket with a couple copies of the Wall Street Journal, actually. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So
like his room at the Ritz-Carlton.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think people was. I mean, when Ghosn was in jail, it was impossible to reach him. I think that's
your stories source reaction to people close to Ghosn. Any elaboration you can provide on what that means?
I can't remember exactly what that refers to, but I would imagine I would probably take a pass on it. But I can't remember exactly what part of the story, because I don't have the story in front of me.
Okay. Are you able to say whether you were able to reach Ghosn himself during these first months of 6 months?
While he was in jail, we couldn't reach him. No.
While he was in jail, I showed up at 4:30 in the morning outside the jail to line up with about 30 other journalists to put in a visitor request, and none of us got the request fulfilled. So I can safely say that he met 2 journalists while he was in jail, and that was 2 French outlets because he was trying to send a message to the French government. But other than that, he did not talk to the press.
I think he might have met 1 Japanese outlet as well.
Yes, he did. He met 1 Japanese outlet. So AFP, Les Echo, and then 1 Japanese outlet. Yeah.
These were visits that I think were, they were 10 minutes through plexiglass with an interpreter present.
And a cop behind him.
With a cop behind him. And this wasn't until, sometime in January. So, and he was obviously arrested in November. So, yeah, in the early days, it was just impossible to hear from Ghosn.
Sean, I'll ask you on this one. The nature of the confinement and the restrictions put on Ghosn during this time, and there were repeated new charges filed against him, which was a reason to prolong the confinement. Do you think that was unusual, even by Japanese standards?
Actually, you know what? Like, the one thing that's unusual about this case in Japan is how long it's taken to come to trial. Everything other than that has been pretty standard operating procedure here. So what the prosecutors do, actually, I should explain, like, the curious thing about this particular case in Japan's legal system is that Carlos Ghosn was never arrested by police. So the arrest, the investigation, the subsequent charges, and the conduct of the trial are all conducted by the prosecutor's office. So the prosecutors tend to arrest somebody, and then the majority of their gathering of evidence for the trial is done through interrogation in jail, right? So Carlos Ghosn was interrogated by prosecutors without a defense attorney present, because you're not allowed to have your defense attorney present during interrogations with prosecutors here in Japan. Every day, 7 days a week, sometimes for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night at the jail. And the same thing happened to Greg Kelly as co-defendant, and the same thing happens to most Japanese defendants. And what they tend to do, and the reason why I think Greg Kelly was arrested in this case, is they grab the main guy, and then they grab the guy just below him, his assistant. And Greg Kelly sort of fits that role here. And they try to get the assistant to sort of say, yeah, what I did was wrong, but he told me to do it, right? They try to get them to point the finger. So there's not a whole lot of wiretapping, as you see in the US, and there's not a whole lot of digital evidence gathering. A lot of it is criminal prosecutions here in Japan tend to rely on oral testimony to prosecutors in jail. And Carlos Ghosn has been a harsh critic of that system ever since, but he's not alone. There's quite a few people in Japan who feel the same way, that the system by prosecutors, where you're stuck in jail and you can't leave, and you can make it all end if you just said, I did something wrong. That's why they call it the hostage justice system, among Japan's critics. It's this idea that they hold you until you admit to wrongdoing. So yeah, it is harsh, but it wasn't unusual in Carlos Ghosn's case.
It's kind of a Napoleonic code, if I could use the French reference there, of justice in Japan. Okay, well, let's put Ghosn aside for a moment, because in June through fall of 2019, your stories that were part of this award were focusing on the struggles within the two companies, Nissan and Renault, in the aftermath of this arrest. The various pressures, government pressures, internal clashes, and such that are going on. How are you two reporting that side of the story?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing to say actually here maybe is, so Sean and I have now been working for a while, and we pass information between each other. So I kind of know a lot what Sean's sources are thinking. He knows what my sources are thinking. And one thing which we saw during those times is that the communication between Renault and Nissan completely broke down. They just, both companies, they just didn't speak to each other. And so actually a lot of people at one company would ask me or Sean what was going on at the other company. And I think that at this particular time, that dynamic proved extremely useful. That we knew what was going on inside the other company better than the people at Renault knew what was going on at Nissan. They just stopped speaking to each other. They were assuming that everybody had the worst of intentions on the other side.
Yeah, we were kind of like the child in the middle of a messy divorce, like where everybody was passing messages through us.
Now, there again, you're competing with your international rivals. Do you think this is going on the same way there? How are you trying to beat them?
Honestly, knowing more than the competitors was kind of the key here, right? So you could go to, I don't want to pick on any of our competitors, but say you could go to competitor A and say, this is what I believe is
We may be losing sound for a moment from Tokyo.
Going on. This is what I think is
Oh,
going
you're
on.
back.
They'll write it, right? We knew some. Oh,
We
I'm
lost
sorry,
you for a
cut out
moment there,
second.
Sean.
All right. Oh, this is unfortunate. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
you're
you were
back.
describing the
Right. So
competition.
I don't know where I cut off, but like knowing more than the competitors was the key. So most of them could go to the competitors and say, this is what I think is happening. And they sort of write the story and whatever. It's just a normal story. But in our case, they would come to us and say, this is this. And then we say, well, what about this? And they're like, well, how the hell did you know about that? Right. So the fact that we knew more and were deeper inside of the respective companies was kind of the key, right? Not only did they sort of fear what we knew, but they also knew that because we knew so much, we would treat the story with the appropriate amount of nuance, maybe is the way to put it, right? We of course, working for the Wall Street Journal, it's required that we always treat them fairly and make sure everybody's views are reflected in the story. But we also knew enough, and we were sort of deep enough inside each of these companies that we knew what was happening before they did, right? The opposing side.
One thing I would say as well about this time period, and some of our competitors, some of them, by the way, as I've already said, did incredible work on this story.
Yeah.
But we were backed by the Wall Street Journal as well, because as you pointed out, Tim, this is now June, July, August, September. These stories which we're talking about, and the arrest happened in November, and some other people have moved on. Right, the arrest was interesting. The aftermath, the kind of civil war between Renault and Nissan, and then they have to do something else. They have to move on to another story or whatever. And I feel like we were backed to just keep going after this story over and over again, keep speaking to people, keep getting stuff out. Our editors kept running it, prominently in the paper on the front page. And I think that's what really helped. We maybe were allowed to have a bit more stamina than others. And so when we get to June, July, this is still basically everything that we're doing, right? I mean, and have been doing for 6 or 7 months. So I think that hugely helped.
What are the two of you learning yourselves that is reshaping your understanding of the story during this period?
I mean, I speak for me personally, but for me personally, like I got to Japan in 2016. And the one thing that you knew about Nissan when you arrived in 2016 is that it was the one company in Japan that was run like a more modern global business with corporate governance and a functioning board and a CEO who talked about shareholder value and whatnot. And the thing that surprised me 6-7 months into the reporting is that was all kabuki theater. It was a whole lot of hand moving and not a lot of sort of progress. So that was the thing that surprised me, is like how badly the relationship, how bad the relationship to Renault and Nissan was. That basically it was like 20 years of constant bickering and infighting, and then Carlos Ghosn basically managed for 20 years to paper over all of those cracks that sort of ruptured and fissured the second he was out of the picture. I mean, that was astounding to me. I mean, everybody assumed that when Carlos Ghosn by 2008, 2009, 2010 had some more cemented his position in each company and sort of talked about synergies and billions in savings every year, you just assumed that it worked and that it was a miracle and that he changed the sort of dynamic and how these companies worked together and sort of had killed the merger in favor of whatever the heck the alliance was, and it turned out to not be true.
That kabuki theater, if you will, was one perhaps his most remarkable achievement.
Well, look, and it was an achievement. I don't want to undermine and sort of and to undersell what Carlos Ghosn did achieve. Look, those two companies are still together today, 20 years on, and they still do work together closely, and they do a lot of great things together. And I don't think either company thinks that they would be better off apart. So that is an accomplishment. It is something maybe nobody else is able to achieve. So it is an accomplishment, but we all assumed that it was what they always said, like win-win, right? That it always worked together, that they sort of had mutual self-interest to sort of make things work. And it just, behind the background, it was just one gigantic cat fight for 20 years.
Well, let's move back to Ghosn for a moment and your August story as part of the entry, which was a scoop on his personal investment in a technology fund, Ghosn and his son, through a kind of cutout in Oman. To this point, I have to say, as a reader, though of course I was surprised by events, the financial inducements to Ghosn to avoid the rather strict salary limitations that major Japanese executives suffer vis-a-vis their international colleagues did not surprise me. That he was essentially working as much as possible to get around those and to, in a sense, feather his nest. But that story in August, I think, began to turn my sense of Ghosn some degrees, because there was a sense that he was really going to the ends of the earth, if you will, to try to find ways to monetize his unusual stature. You want to speak, either of you, to that story?
Yeah, Sean, do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, why don't you give it a shot?
So that story's, I mean, it's interesting because it's basically when Ghosn is arrested for a second time in Japan, it's for, breach of trust and these payments coming from Oman, which end up, which he uses to buy a yacht and invest in startups. Now, Ghosn has always said, and it's important, very important, and we point out in the story, but I'll point out again, that these payments had nothing to do with Nissan, and that the person, a guy called Devyendu Kumar, who was sending him that money, was doing it in a personal capacity, and therefore there was no wrongdoing. But Ghosn, and I don't know if he will, I hope so at some point, but has never gone further than that. He's just said these payments were made personally by Devyendu Kumar. There is no link to Nissan. There's no illegality, and therefore that's it. The end. But he hasn't gone on to explain any more, like why Devyendu Kumar was sending him that money. And so, look, I mean, that story really, I think we got out what we knew. We had bank statements showing where the money had come from, a bank account in Switzerland, where it ended up, what Ghosn bought with it. We made no claims over whether it's legal or illegal. We don't know. Obviously, the Japanese claim it is. Ghosn says it isn't. We're not judges. So, I mean, it's kind of a strange one because it was the information that we had, and it's actually hard to build a narrative out of bank statements, which is largely what we were trying to do. So, but yeah, it's interesting, and then there's the question of, is it right for Carlos Ghosn to go into business with someone who is working for essentially a Nissan client and not tell Nissan about it? Again, he says there's no issue. Other people, for example, in Nissan, says that is the whole issue and what the whole Carlos Ghosn case is about. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, Sean, do you want to add anything about that story? I mean, it's a story I wish we knew more. To this day, I wish we knew more about these investments.
I think and I 100% agree with Nick there that while the story is obviously important and moves the story forward, I don't think anybody expected that the story would take a twist that involved a 100-meter yacht, a 100-foot yacht. Like, I don't think we were thinking in that direction when we first started reporting the story or investments in Silicon Valley. I think it sort of underlined the messiness of this whole story, right? Where you had huge amounts of gray area in this whole thing. And Nick and I, by this point, so this is August 2019 when we put out this story. By August, Nick and I had absolutely given up trying to determine whether or not, in our minds, Carlos Ghosn had committed a crime. Right? It seemed like it was a hopeless enterprise, because so much was unknown. And still, I think, frankly, today is unknown about Carlos Ghosn's motivations and whether or not he crossed the line from a legal standpoint. But still, at the end of the day, the one thing that was really important, I think, about that story about the Silicon Valley Fund and the money he got from Oman is it kind of underlined the problems that Carlos Ghosn had created for himself by doing all this stuff in secret, clouded in sort of this big cloud of personal, sort of business. At the same time, he's running a publicly held company. Like, when the prosecutors get a hold of this information, and I think when normal people look at this information, they see Carlos Ghosn buying this multi-million-dollar yacht and investing millions of dollars in Silicon Valley, and the money allegedly comes from one of his company's customers, or even if it's not his company's customers in Carlos Ghosn's retelling, it's an executive at the business of a Nissan sort of client. There's no, I mean, you can't, there's huge questions raised about the proprietariness of his actions. And so I thought it was an important sort of story that moved our understanding along of how the problems around Carlos Ghosn were created by this idea that Carlos Ghosn sort of hid all these machinations from the companies that he ran and thought that that was okay for so many years. And then finally, when he was caught out, it just blew up in his face.
We have a question from one of my OPC board colleagues, Bill Holstein, with considerable reporting experience himself in Japan. He's wondering, among other things, how has Ghosn maintained his wealth through all of this? Do we know how secure is that wealth at this point?
I mean, it's a really good question. Again, another one I wish I knew more about. I mean, frankly, yeah, I think we can make an educated guess that this has obviously hit his net worth hugely, but I don't know more than that.
Well, we do know he's in Lebanon, in a country with severe capital controls right now. That you can get money in, but you can't get it out. And Carlos Ghosn has expenses outside of Lebanon. It's a strange place to be for him right now, because even if he had money, it's not easy to get access to it.
Does the question of how rich he is or will be, is that relevant to the question of venality and all of this? I mean, as I was saying, I as a sort of casual reader, wasn't surprised that he was trying to build his kitty beyond what a Japanese corporate executive would make. But if it extended much beyond that, then I guess my picture of him changes in my mind. So I'm wondering whether you guys see it that same way, or are the dollars we're talking about here not really pertinent to whether he was the guilty party in all of this or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think Carlos Ghosn thought, and he was open and has been open about this, he thought he deserved to be paid like the very, very best in industry, whether it's the CEO of GM or the CEO of Ford, or, Marchioni at the time of when he was CEO of Fiat. And that in France and in Japan, that's not acceptable. But that it's a global marketplace, and he's getting offers from all of these companies to go and manage them. But I don't know. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but yeah, I don't know. I don't see that he wanted necessarily to go beyond that, beyond, the kind of, what he felt he was owed for the value he was creating, and the fact that he was in a global marketplace.
Yeah, I'll go one step further. So the genesis of the criminal charges against Carlos Ghosn is that in 2010, when Japan started requiring individual disclosures of salaries, Carlos Ghosn basically cut his pay in half to avoid PR issues, right? So he at least had the awareness that he had been earning a certain amount of money, and he thought that if it became public, it would be a problem, not only in Japan but also in France. So, and Carlos Ghosn was also very public after the disclosures, arguing his case that he deserved the salary he was getting, right? And in fact, talking to people at Nissan, he thought he was worth a whole lot more, and as Nick was saying, is worth as much as anybody else in the business. So I think that much is clear. Now, whether you call that greed, I think is a hard question to answer, right? Because look, we at the Wall Street Journal, we cover CEOs around the world, and the difference between Carlos Ghosn and I think a lot of CEOs is that, you know, you may earn $100 million a year as the head of a publicly held company, but usually what you do is you go to shareholders and you say, I'm worth $100 million a year, you pay me that or I'm going to walk, right? You tell the board that, and you tell shareholders that. That didn't happen in Carlos Ghosn's case, right? That's the difference here. And I don't know if that amounts to a crime. I'm not a lawyer, but that is, I think, is an important difference. And maybe it's a function of the fact that he headed a Japanese and a French company, right? You can't do that, right? Or you don't have that sort of precedent of being a CEO in London or being a CEO in the US. But it is a difference. And it's a difference I think is worth noting, that, you know, if you want to make a certain amount of money, normally what CEOs do in that case is they go to the board and they go to shareholders and say, oh, this is what I'm worth, and you can either pay me that or I'm going to look for another job. And Carlos Ghosn didn't do that.
Let's return to the corporate side of this for a moment. Nick, you made reference to Fiat Chrysler. That Fiat Chrysler, in Ghosn's eyes, I think, was always going to be the grand coup, the coup de grace, bringing about a combination of Fiat Chrysler with his Nissan Renault empire. As 2019 progressed, and as your story, I believe in June noted, that merger dream is beginning to collapse.
Yeah, I mean, actually, they agreed a deal, amazingly, between Renault and Fiat Chrysler. But the issue was that they hadn't spoken to Nissan about it, and so Nissan, you know, wasn't best pleased about this deal, made some demands. The French government was worried about Nissan's demands, so the French government wanted to stall. And in the end, you know, this merger fell apart, and it was, I mean, I've rarely seen a merger like this. I mean, it was literally announced, and then Renault and Fiat and, you know, their advisors just tried to ram it through. Tried to get Nissan on board, get the French state on board. There was a bunch of board meetings, and then the whole thing blew up in 2 weeks. And then, even though the Renault really wanted it, I think they just couldn't. They could never get their act together to get Fiat Chrysler back at the table, and Fiat Chrysler ended up with Renault's, you know, longtime French rival Peugeot. But yeah, I think this is something that Ghosn had looked at. Now, I don't think conversations were particularly advanced. I think they mostly took place after Marchionni died. But, you know, this was one of the most botched deals that I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it was a disaster, and it just added to the sense of, like, I mean, the companies were in total disarray, and it was also, you know, when you look back at it now, it was probably not a terrible idea for Renault, and in a way they were trying to rebalance the alliance, you know, because Renault was clearly the weaker partner. Now, if Renault suddenly is half of Fiat Chrysler, then when it starts negotiating with Nissan, it does so from a period of strength. But the way they did it was just, you know, from day one was very messy and never going to work.
And I think it underlined, in a way, the weakness in the relationship that we mentioned earlier, that the second Carlos Ghosn was out of the picture, they can't have a civilized conversation with one another. I mean, the
Yeah.
second that Renault comes to Nissan and says, we want to cut a deal with FCA, are you okay with it? Nissan's reaction is to like say, okay, let's start horse trading about what our terms of that agreement are, and the terms are to weaken, sort of Renault's relationship with Nissan even more, right? Like,
yeah, and frankly, they didn't even say like, we want to cut a deal with FCA. Are you okay with it? They said, we have cut a deal with FCA. FYI, it's going to be announced in a few hours. I mean, I remember learning. We wrote about that deal. I think it was on the Saturday. Deal was announced on the Monday. So a couple of days before, and I was ringing up sources, I'm sure Sean you were too, at Nissan, being like, that Renault and FCA are going to working towards a merger on Monday, and they couldn't believe it. They were dumbfounded. They thought we must be mistaken. So that just shows like that they were literally told at the very, very, very last minute about this plan.
Yeah. So your last story in the entry was December 2019. You report that the alliance between Nissan and Renault is starting to crack. Where are we with those two companies now in the aftermath of Carlos Ghosn?
I mean, it's unclear. So, we're on the Nissan side, we're on our second CEO. So Saikawa was also pushed out, and we have a new guy in charge. And the Renault CEO has been pushed out. We have a new guy in charge, and they're sort of starting over with people who had nothing to do with any of this Ghosn-related stuff. And I think the hope is that they have a fresh start. But I don't know. Like, sure, I think a lot of the sort of the bickering has stopped, but it's unclear because a lot of the stuff they're talking about doing today and projects that they're working on were started like 5 years ago, right? So it's not clear that things have gotten better. And at Nissan, it's not clear that their attitude towards Renault has gotten better. I don't know, Nick, you can probably speak to Renault more than I can, but I think the battle lines are drawn the same way that they were the day Carlos Ghosn was arrested, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah, for me, like part of the difference is just that both companies are having so many issues right now that Nissan is focused on itself, trying to solve its issues. Renault is focused on itself, trying to solve its issues, and therefore we have less bickering because they're not working together quite as much. I mean, but I mean, for the alliance to go to the next step, I think, yeah, I don't know that they can manage it. I mean,
yeah.
What does this episode tell foreign executives who might be considering taking a job in Japanese management? One just did at Mitsubishi Chemical, I believe. There have been others over the last couple of years who've had their own problems, not on the level of Carlos Ghosn, but nevertheless problems. Is that still a no-go territory, do you think, for an international manager?
Well, I guess another legacy of Carlos Ghosn to remember is the fact that he opened up that job to foreigners, right? Carlos Ghosn was the first one to come over 20 years ago and run a Japanese company. The fact that he was able to succeed at all for as long as he did, I think encouraged people, and actually, frankly, more than encouraged outsiders, encouraged Japanese people that foreigners could run a Japanese company. So I don't think that Carlos Ghosn's demise or the fact that he was pushed out has discouraged most people from considering the job. It remains a rare thing because Japan, to anybody who's been here, you realize operates a little bit differently and thinks a little bit differently than most other places. I think more than that, though, what Carlos Ghosn's sort of arrest has highlighted is the resistance and the sort of the inertia surrounding what he wanted to do with these companies, right? So he ran quintessentially French company and a quintessentially Japanese company, and his hope was to transform them over a 20-year period into a international sort of multinational, sort of corporation where it didn't matter if your origins were in Japan or it didn't matter if your origins were in France. He was going to rebuild his companies in his own image as a Brazilian-born man of Lebanese origin who was educated and came up in France, right? There's sort of this globalist, sort of idea of a corporation. And the resistance to that idea that persisted over 20 years was the impetus of his downfall. So I think that more than the sort of the fear of the Japanese justice system, it's what sort of person is going to want to come to Japan and run a Japanese company, right? Are you going to be just a caretaker for a storied company like Mitsubishi Chemical, where your job is to sort of just expand its business overseas, or are you going to attract the ambitious sort like Carlos Ghosn, who sees a undervalued and sort of overlooked company and sort of polish it off and find the diamond underneath, right? And try to change it into something different. It's a question of ambition more than it is, sort of people taking opportunities.
Nick, any closing thoughts on the legacy of the downfall of Carlos Ghosn?
I'm not sure I do, actually. I mean, I think Sean described it pretty well just now. Talking about trying to build a company in his own image. I mean, I think that's essentially what he did. And Ghosn, he really believes that culture kind of matters, and he's, you can feel how strongly he, thinks about his Brazilian side, his French side, his Lebanese side. And I think, so just Sean, on the whole globalist thing, I think that is what he wanted to do. But also it took him 20 years to get these companies to a place where he thought about putting a holding company on top of them, because he was so respectful in the end of their various cultures. And he saw that, other car companies who maybe had been through mergers or takeovers or whatever, that had actually destroyed value. And so he was trying to do it in such a way that didn't just, that maybe didn't make sense straight away on a spreadsheet, but they kind of respected everybody's values and stuff like that. And it was just walking this tightrope between, building this kind of very modern company domiciled in the Netherlands, but yet still respecting the French and Japanese culture. It was just a very, very difficult exercise. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that he could have succeeded. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sean,
it certainly blew up. Well, it blew up in his face at the moment he was going to try it, right? I mean, it's kind of like with the Alliance. He was going to try to do something that hadn't really worked before or nobody thought could work. And in this instance, it just kind of all blew up in his face the second he was ready to go through with it.
Right. Well, as you were noting, the resources of the Wall Street Journal and some of its great competitors provide a basis for this kind of cross-cultural reporting of business that this story absolutely exemplified. So congratulations again to both of you. I think the story isn't over. Whether Carlos Ghosn somehow has another chapter in his story to be written, we don't know. But Nissan and Renault and their competitors will continue to try to sort out some of these issues we've been discussing, and you guys will be reporting on them. So thanks again, and congratulations. I hope you've enjoyed this chat as much as I have.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.